Welcome to Hawley Local History Society. Tonight's talk is by Dr Nick Barratt. Nick will talk about the impact that the TV programme, Who Do You Think You Are?, had on family history research. Please visit www.hawleyhistory.org.uk for more information and details of future talks.
Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and apologies for giving the organisers palpitations with my increasingly frantic text messages. I would just like to dwell on what's just been said about memory and experience and knowledge. It goes to the heart of what I want to talk about tonight. It goes to the heart of the programme that I'm loosely basing my talk around, Who Do You Think You Are? Because in that title, I think lies the question that we all ask about people that are no longer with us. And there's something about making sure we do ask those questions, or possibly take it into our own hands to capture, to share, to spread that knowledge before it is lost. And in many ways I'm doing the end of my talk at the beginning, because we do live in this digital age where the magic of technology allows us to communicate instantly when there's a problem and work out alternative routes. But also it can challenge the way we, or possibly our ancestors, used to communicate, the way they used to write things down, the way they used to share their little moments, things such as letters and correspondence, postcards, little snippets of our lives that often go out and we forget about. And it's a very different way of sharing that information now. We communicate using emails or text messages or post on social media. And quite often that information is instantly disposed of, instantly shared, and you just wonder what sort of archival resources will exist in the future. My talk's going to take us back 19-20 years to when the idea of Who Do You Think You Are was first conceptualised. The programme first appeared in 2004, and I'll talk about that early series. But I want to take us back in time, as a good historian would, I suppose, to think about what life was like before the internet. And in many ways, this artificial divide between those that do local history and those that do family history. And in many ways, a further divide about those that do academic history and take a rather condescending view of those that do family and local history. And I must admit, I tended to come from that background. My PhD is not in anything related to what I'm talking about tonight. My doctorate, which took 3 years to research, write, and then defend at a viva, was on 13th century state finance and fiscal history, which I'm sure you would agree is a worthy and noble subject, and I will now talk to you for an hour about it. No, I won't, honestly. But that's a very academic view, isn't it? You find an area, and then you specialise, so that you become a leading expert. I think there's about 3 or 4 others of us in the world at the moment, so we've pretty much got this field to ourselves. And that's the very academic view of things, and I will do a bit of generalisation. And in many ways, some of this was the manifestation of the academic view on television back in the early 2000s. The sense that all the best history programmes had to be presented by an academic, usually white, male, of a certain vintage. Occasionally, a young bright thing might appear like Bettany Hughes, but it was a very academic view. The presenter would tell you their story, and it was often about the great and the good, kings, queens, politicians, aristocrats, generals, but never really the stories of our ancestors or the places where our ancestors lived. The exception perhaps is Michael Wood, who did look at that worm's eye view, but only really after Who Do You Think You Are had come along. And the series, in its own way, was a challenge to this view of the past, this worm's eye view, confronting the fact that maybe it excludes lots of people from that sense of understanding. I mean, I'm sure we've enjoyed those programmes by Simon Sharma and others, but did we actually feel represented in them? Did we actually see ourselves having those ancestral connections to the aristocrats or the kings and queens, or possibly not? And I think this is the challenge that we faced. Now, I must admit I held that view, and having done my PhD, I realised a couple of things. The first was that it had made me completely unemployable. So I had to cast around for something else to do with the rest of my life. And the only place that would give me a home was the National Archives, or as it was called back in the day, the Public Records Office. Now, I thought that my role in this wonderful institution, joining the medieval and early modern team, would be to help catalogue and explore these ancient records. And if I was really bold, I might then start to branch out in my own area. My PhD was focused on 1225, a really important year, as I'm sure we're all aware. And I thought, well, maybe I'll look at 1226 if I'm lucky. You know, there's that specialisation again. So you can imagine my shock and surprise when I realised that most people coming up at the inquiry desks weren't interested in my views of how the ancient exchequer worked. They wanted to find out more about their ancestors. They wanted to learn about family history. And I must admit, I was rather dismissive of this. What on earth would you want to do that for? You know, that academic view. And I think this was reflected in some of the challenge faced by the programme in its early days. 2004, this was very different. And many of the early reviewers called it, and I quote, self-indulgent navel-gazing. Now, what does that tell you about the perception of this new style of programme and the worth of what we do? But in many ways, my encounters in these early years at the National Archives, Public Record Office, made me think twice about that perception of the value of family or local history, that worm's eye view. Because I learned two things about the people coming up to me at the desk. The first was the passion, enthusiasm and enjoyment of actually wrestling with some of these very complicated records and simply finding stuff out. And the important thing here is that they've had to turn to original records because the lives of their ancestors or the places in which they lived often weren't recorded in big books or television programmes. It wasn't the sort of stuff that we were taught about at school. So this voyage of discovery took people into really unique territory, finding new stuff out about the sort of people that most historians wouldn't bother to consider worthy of note because they didn't do great things with their lives. In all of these generalisations and assumptions about what makes a great life. Here we are trying to find out that minutiae of history. And that joy and passion often echoed literally around the reading rooms, these very quiet spaces, these intimidating spaces where all the professors and academics would spend their time looking at the ancient stuff, and then we'd rock up and suddenly find out that the story being told about our ancestor was true, and they had been convicted of a terrible crime and transported to America, clapped in irons. How exciting is that? This was actually a real challenge when we were doing Who Do You Think You Are? I mean, nowadays, the contributors get a bit disappointed if there isn't some scandalous story that they can dine out on for the rest of their lives. But we didn't want to tell those stories. So when Who Do You Think You Are was first conceived, it was seen very much as a fusion of a little bit of genealogy, a large dollop of local history, to tell a social history story. And I'll come back to this. We wanted to tell 10 strands of British history, sometimes British meaning the British relationship with the rest of the world, but a lot of it looking at aspects that changed society from about the 1850s to the mid-20th century. And this was what we wanted to do. Our celebrities, and I'll come back to why we use celebrities a bit later, but our celebrities were in many ways the voice of us, encountering people along the way. The model for this was Time Team, where you have Tony Robinson, who's not an archaeologist, but was there to ask the sort of questions that we might ask if someone's dug up an ancient piece of pottery. What is that? Where does it come from? How do you know how old that is? And he became our voice. He brought us closer to the history, to the scholarship, and he humanised the people telling him that stuff. And that's what we wanted our celebrities to be, our voice. Their ancestors, they would encounter along the way, and they would be used to illustrate a strand of social history each week. So that's what we wanted. What we didn't want are awkward people, the sorts of scandalous ancestors that would mean we'd have to sort of divert from our narrative theme. And one of the first people that had this challenge was Leslie Garrett. Now, Leslie's story was all about coal mining and community, the real essence of what it meant to be living in a coal mining community. And of course, music ran through that. Colliery bands, the pride and the tradition of the songs and the folk music that would be then passed down through the generations through song and music. And she wanted to find out more about her musical heritage. So that's what we did. We had a look at her background. But along the way, we came up against her 2 times great-grandfather, John Garrett. Now, his story was key because it got us back into that coal mining, but not in the way we were anticipating. Now, John Garrett was a butcher in a local community, and he ran his butcher's shop where people would come in every day to get their fresh cuts of meat, swap gossip, have a natter. He was well known and well respected in the community. And then at the end of each day, he'd close his shop. He'd cleanse his workbench with concentrated acid, which was the thing you did at the time to get rid of all the nasty bits. And then he'd retire for a nice meal with his wife, Mary. One night, things did not go according to the normal routine. A terrible accident occurred. As he recounted afterwards, he'd sat down with his wife and poured her a nice glass of wine, which he claims she sort of drank in one draught, and then dashed the glass to the ground and fell choking, whereupon she promptly expired. Now, what had caused this? Well, any sudden death would have a coroner's interest immediately. So the coroner came in and asked a few questions, and a few things didn't quite stack up. First of all, why was the beveled poison bottle containing the acid on the dining room table, which he'd clearly poured, instead of wine? How could a man who works with this noxious substance every day have accidentally brought it out of his workshop into the dining room table, poured it to his wife by mistake? Oh. And then, why would she then drink the whole lot? Surely one taste and the bitterness and the burning would dash it to the ground. So something didn't quite tally. Now, the coroner just happened to be a close friend and distant relative of John Garrett. So perhaps it's unsurprising that the verdict was death by misadventure. Now, that didn't stop local tongues from wagging, and I guess they wagged ever harder when 2 weeks later he ran off with a much younger woman. Draw your own conclusions, folks. Well, that's what we had to present to Leslie, and she, of course, drew the conclusion that we did. And we were really nervous about how she would react. But she looked at the newspaper account where the coroner's inquest was reported, salacious detail, the lifeblood of local newspapers, of course. And she looked and read, and her eyes widened, and she clapped her hands with glee and said, "How exciting, there's a murderer in the family." Not the reaction we were expecting. Isn't it interesting, though, how we settle on these figures, to dine out on? I found that my great uncle was a Soviet spy in the 1920s and early 1930s. Now, I got very excited at the time. Bit less so in today's environment, but when this was first discovered, it was, oh God, I've got to have my "who do you think you are" moment. That's my badge of fame. My uncle wasn't so impressed, because he could remember this chap growing up as a child. So maybe there's something about being far enough back in time to be safe and being close enough to be awkward. And there's the thing, isn't it? Once you've made that discovery, you can't put them back in the box. You can't help but share it. And that proximity to that ancestor or that story really changes how we react to it. So there's a bit of a health warning if you haven't done any delving into your past. You never know what you might find. And that temptation to share might have unintended consequences for the family. There's another story involving my grandmother, where through a convoluted process we've worked out who her father was, involving DNA and a huge dose of international research. And it's clear that my great-grandfather was a bit of a shady character. It seems to run in my family. A bit worrying, isn't it? Yeah, I should tell you about my kids. And this guy was an imposter. He created a fraudulent identity. He was a bigamist. He committed a felony. He was in San Quentin prison in the States. It's perhaps unsurprising that his descendants actually want to make contact and share some of what I've discovered with them. So, there's a lesson there about just being sensitive to others. Anyway, I digress. This passion and enthusiasm manifests itself in all sorts of ways. That joy of discovery, but also in another way. And the thing that really struck me the most when I was working at the National Archives, and ever since, my road to Damascus moment, if you like, was the sheer sophistication of the research that we undertake, whether it's a person, a house, a location. We do things that many academic researchers simply don't do. The sheer breadth and extent of our research. Let's think about a genealogy, for example. We start by ransacking our memory banks and talking to our family about what we think we know about our relatives. And it's amazing how quickly memory fades. Can anyone here name their 8 great-grandparents from scratch without looking at notes? Show of hands, come on. Absolutely no one. So that's how far back living memory gets you. So we go to the family archive. And this is where you find those letters and postcards, the ephemera, the stuff that you're not going to find in a state archive. And if we're lucky, we've kept it and preserved it. And that's the great thing about our ancestors. They didn't have modern technology. They wrote stuff down. They were hoarders. Thank goodness they were. But also just think about how many of our 1, 2, 3 generations back kept all this stuff, then it got cleared when they passed. And how that fragile memory of someone's life is gone, and how important it is for ourselves to make sure it's shared. Anyway, I'll come back to that theme maybe later. So we look at the family archives, we try and find some of these stories that I've just talked about. We try and build our first family tree, which again many people think is the outcome. That is the reason why we do genealogy. It's just simply a map of our roots to help us organise our research. So we put all of this down, and you might go 1, 2 generations back with a few names. And then we start to verify that information. And it's amazing how much of our family folklore falls apart at first examination. It's amazing how many of our celebrities gave us their wrong dates of birth when doing the programme. You'd think that would be a pretty basic thing, but no, most of them are much older than they claim to be. So there's a tip, never believe anything that you're told. So we go into the official records, don't we? We look at indexes to birth, marriage, death records back to 1837 for England and Wales. We then start to connect our generations back. A lot of this is online these days. So we then start to look at some of the more contextual material, which is where we start to fuse our family tree with where people lived and what they did. We look at census returns, 1921 back to 1841, linking people with place, the house, but also the other information it tells you, an occupation, who else is in the family, what they did, when they were born, where they were born, who are the neighbours, what does that tell you about the local area? So then we start looking at maps. How did that area change over time? How do we contextualise their lives? We go back even further, before some of this Victorian bureaucracy, into parish registers. We look at occupational records. Now that is highly sophisticated, interlinked research. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. This whole thing that it's a hobby and a pastime that we do when we retire, this self-indulgent navel-gazing, nonsense. Anyone who's done any local or family history research, I can guarantee should be awarded a PhD, because A, key criterion here, it's an original contribution to history. And B, let's look at the sophistication, the chronological period, and the range of sources that we have to look at. The genre that we explore. Like I said, you can't look at family history without looking at the place where people lived. You can't look at places without populating with the people. You can't do either without looking at the socio-economic factors that change that area, that push-pull factor that moved people away or into an area. Or was it industry? Or was it the call of the Queen's shilling to go overseas and fight? Was it poverty that drove people into the workhouse or repatriated to an emerging mill town in another part of the country? These are the factors we can explore. And we can do that through a combination of online records today, park that thought, I'll come back to it, but good old forensic research in archives. And that's the bit where television programmes often let us down. How many times have we gnashed our teeth in frustration at any one of these programmes where the research methodology is airbrushed out? If you're lucky, you might see a presenter walk into a space, and then as if by magic, they appear, like Mr. Ben from the 70s cartoons, for those who can remember it, in the location where the book is waiting for them, and it opens at the right page, and there is their ancestor's name popping out, possibly with the help of a walking encyclopedia in the sense of a local expert. If you're very lucky, you might get a sense of a speeded up montage of some of the research techniques, card indexes, fiche, index volumes, and I think this is because the perception of an archive to TV producers is something akin to Hogwarts Library from the Harry Potter films. It has to be a really ancient oak-panelled building with manuscripts on the shelves full of dust, which often are candlelit. And when they get to an archived film, they are really quite surprised to find they have windows and light and electricity and computers and the internet. So the first thing they do, and I've been involved in so many films, this is not just me making it up, they find a dark corner, they turn out the lights and they set dress it to make it look like an old place. So there are barriers. You don't get the sense of how, and you don't get the sense of location either. Because let's face it, TV is an entertainment medium. It's not necessarily there to educate. Anyway, let's get back to Who Do You Think You Are? So I've explained a little bit about what they wanted to do and why. So this was a programme about social history, 10 themes, neatly described up front, things such as poverty, transportation networks, the railway, coal mining, migration, emigration, a whole range of things, 10 themes. This was to be one series only, and the idea was that we would have a celebrity, because they bring in ratings, and they're also very professional in front of a camera, who will be our guide as we explore this theme through their ancestors. So it was never intended to be a genealogy show. It was about social history, and if you think about it, most of the time it's about local history because we visit the places where things happened, and we talk about why they happened in that way. So even though the genealogy and family history community put its arm around Who Do You Think You Are, and it's a family history show, actually it isn't. It's social history, it's local history, it's a personal journey, yes, but that was never how it was conceived. In fact, it wasn't even called Who Do You Think You Are, and I'll come back to that as well. I hope you're making notes about what I'm meant to be coming back to, by the way. If you know where it is, I won't remember. Anyway.
You can't ruin.
X marks the spot. Excellent. So that was our challenge as a research team. Now, I'd come across, having worked with a few of the producers, I'd also worked with the BBC creating this concept. And there's all sorts of origin stories about Who Do You Think You Are. So my take is that there was this idea that came out of the BBC. They wanted to do something about social history. They held up a programme by Gordon Honeycomb from the late 70s, early 80s, and said this is how we don't want to do it, because he just did family history by looking at sources. This was about social history. So our challenge for this 10-part commission was to find a celebrity for each theme. Nowadays, you'd Google them. Back in 2002-03, there wasn't an awful lot on the internet. It seems ridiculous, 20 years ago, but a lot of it was trying to cast without knowing what we were casting. So we created a shortlist, 150 candidates were put forward. And then we had to try and categorise them based on what their biographies said, what their agents said, what they thought they were interested in, and then start to do some light touch research to see which of the 10 categories they would best suit. And some are more obvious than others, but others sort of matured as we started to work with them. And I'll talk a little bit about the way we approach this and the barriers that we put in our own way to make this programme work. So we'd find a celebrity. There's a celebrity here. Okay, so what are you interested in? Great, okay, that sort of fits. Now, is there anyone in your family that can tell us further stories? Have they got access to the family archive? What sort of stories can they share with us? Great, okay, you're not allowed to talk to them again. I exaggerate slightly. But the idea was that to make the programme work, we had to take the celebrity on a journey of discovery so their reactions would be real and genuine. And that has been the case throughout the 18 years of making the show, with one exception. And that one exception was our case study, We also chose this individual because we thought that they would have the cachet, the pulling power to persuade other celebrities to do the show. That individual was Jeremy Clarkson. Why are you laughing? I haven't even told you the story yet. Now, we did a huge amount of research just to test to see whether this would work, and Jeremy wasn't that keen to do the show. He was really lukewarm at best. He couldn't understand how it would work, and I'll explain a bit about that in a minute. And so to persuade him that this was a really interesting thing and that actually a huge amount of research lay beneath it, we presented him with his family tree, fully researched, with the names of his ancestors and some little notes about each of the key people that we thought made an interesting story linked to our theme, and which is very much around social mobility and industry. And we filmed him in his kitchen looking at this document, and it made the final film. The bits that you didn't see was the process that got us to where we ended up. And he looked at it and he was immediately drawn to the Clarksons. And he went back generation after generation with an increasingly quizzical and puzzled look on his face. These guys weren't very interesting. They're nothing more than genetic landfill. Not a great start. So we looked at the next bunch, and they were coal miners, one of our key stories, we thought. And he immediately sort of hands on hips, no. I don't want to go down a coal mine, because you'll take me to a coal mine to do this film. I'm not interested, not going to do that. So we moved along and found some architects, the Smethurst family, very upstanding in the local community. I'm sure they'd had some fine buildings. He wasn't impressed. They're probably hideous buildings, not interested in them either. And so we went, each family line, one after another, critiqued and disposed of with withering disdain, until we got to a name on the far end of the female branch of the family. And you could see the cogs whirring in his mind. The name was clearly connecting, and he happened to glance up in his kitchen, and he looked back down and saw the connection. The name there was Kilner. The name there was Kilner Jar. Great, he said. They must be my relations. I must be worth millions. I'll do the show. So the programme became the search for missing millions. And we found the connection. He was indeed descended from that branch of the Kilner family. Generation after generation, building the business and then drinking it away. Spending the money on fast cars and fast women. How ironic. Jeremy was most disappointed. Anyway, we got his interest, we did the show. But that's the only time we have presented information in advance. We usually have to lock our celebrities in the production car to stop them going in and asking awkward questions of our experts in their eagerness to find out more. So we do this for a number of reasons. We want that reaction shot to be real, to be genuine. You know, with television there's lots of retakes and things, and you know, most of the time that's because, you know, a plane goes overhead or a kind member of the public drives past and points out that you're filming, and yes, we ask, but I have to stop and wait until you've not pointed out we're filming, you know, things like that. But the reaction shots, we have 2 cameras filming from every angle, 1 take. We might do pickups about questions, but that immediate moment, that has to be genuine, because that gives the authenticity to the programme. But to do that, we have to keep them away from their family, who we work very closely with, to find out the information. I'll give you an example of how that works in a second. So that's the first big red line. We want to work with you on a show that is involving your family, but you can't talk to your family about it. And that made a lot of people very nervous. What are we going to do? I mean, nowadays, because of that authenticity and the way we've approached it, everyone wants to be on Who Do You Think You Are? In fact, during the first series, we had someone say, can I be on next week? No, absolutely not. Anyway, that knocked a lot of people out of that 150. We then started to explain how we were going to work, and it's linked to that first point. If you are presenting a TV show the old-fashioned way, you know, you're Simon Sharma, Mal Ferguson, whoever it is, you rehearse, you write the script with the director, you learn your script, you do your piece to camera, and then when you hear cut, you take the script out and you learn your next piece to camera. You learn your ad-libs. We have a script, they don't see it. And that, again, makes presenters really nervous when they're trying to do a programme. What am I going to say next? How am I going to react to a certain type of celebrity who is more comfortable with this than others? But then the final barrier, again, for various reasons about certain films needing a certain tone, and some of our celebrities wanting to lighten up subjects like the Holocaust, which is not a subject that you can add levity to. We decided that we had to keep a very tight editorial line about what the final show looked like. Now, most of the magic of television happens in the edit suite. On average, we research for 3 to 6 months, we put a filming schedule together, we then go on the road with our celebrities for 12, 14 days, ideally as a block, to wherever the story takes us, and we film 8, 10 hours a day. So let's make the numbers easy. We create roughly 100 hours of footage that we then boil down to a 1-hour programme. So the maths is easy. 99% of stuff gets discarded for the reasons I mentioned. So the job of the editor is to work with the director and possibly the series producer to take all of that footage and create a coherent narrative, of course, as we intended, down one of these particular social history lines. That's a really tough ask. It can take 6, 8 weeks of just simply looking at all of this stuff and sequencing it, checking it back, boiling it down, putting music, and really importantly, putting a voiceover against it as well. Now, what's the role of a voiceover in a TV show? Well, on the assumption that I've been told many times that we, the audience, have 30-second attention spans, it tells you what it is you are seeing. And then it tells you what you're going to see next, and then it tells you what you've just seen to connect what you've seen next. Because if we don't do that, we will lose concentration. We'll forget what it is we're watching. We'll channel hop. Genuinely, they try and break things down into sort of 30 seconds to a minute, so it's then linked together. And the role of the voiceover artist is to do that linkage. And in most programs, that voice is the presenter, the person who's written it and gives that authenticity. I don't know whether you're watching Frozen Planet 2, and we're obviously not seeing David Attenborough going to all of these cold places, but it's still his voice. He carries it. But with Who Do You Think You Are, we don't use our celebrities. They're excluded from the edit suite. So we keep that integrity and authenticity. We use a voiceover artist. So for our first run, and as we thought our only run, it was a very simple equation. No access to family to make a family history style show. No access to a script, and no access to an edit suite. Put that together, no celebrities. Out of that 150, we were left with 20 to 30 who still wanted to do the show. So our odds of finding a match had diminished greatly. And this artificial construct did change as we started working with a celebrity that I'll come on to. But to show how close we were to losing some of these stories and how tricky and how much emphasis was placed on the research, I'll share with you the example of Ian Hislop. I don't know whether you remember this because it's 18 years ago, but Ian's story was inspired by his interest in military history. When he was growing up at school, he remembered vividly writing about the Boer War. He wrote about it in very unenlightened terms. He saw it as this great sort of daring-do adventure, going off, empire, beating the Boers, rah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So we investigated his family. And first of all, we found that his mother had been born in the Channel Islands during the Second World War. And of course, this was the part of British territory that was occupied by the Nazis. And she lived through that. So we took him there and explored that storyline with him. What was it like to live in an occupied territory where your friends, your neighbours would disappear at night, taken off to mainland Europe, possibly to what we now know as concentration camps, never to be seen? What was it like to know that some of your same friends and neighbours were collaborating with the enemy? What was it like to see your high street with its familiar British brands now suddenly adorned with Nazi insignia? Really compelling stuff, because it was a personal story to Ian. We then looked one generation further back, and one of his grandfathers had served in the First World War in a Scottish regiment. So Ian's, with the name like Hislop's, got lots of Scottish ancestors. And we were working with one of his cousins to work out what his grandfather had seen and witnessed during the First World War. So standard research off to the National Archives, understanding which regiment he was in, finding the unit war diaries, linking them to the trench maps, and then we took him back out to where his grandfather had been billeted on the eve of the Great Push in 1918. And armed with copies of those documents, we took Ian to the very spot within a few metres of where his grandfather stood on the morning of going over the top. And he read the operational commands. Now, quite a lot of these are fairly denuded of any humanity. It was all, okay, at 05:30, when the statistical what should have happened, and then you got the accounts of some of the officers and men who wrote it up afterwards for the official histories. At 05:30, the guns did indeed fall silent. So he stood in the spot where his grandfather would have been, and can imagine, the sort of the ringing in the ears as the gun stopped, and the smell of cordite in the air, knowing that you've got that moment, that 15 minutes to think about what you're going to do next. And then, as the whistles started to go with the bayonets fixed, he, leading his company, would climb from the duck boards using the ladders and walk towards no man's land and capture those enemy trenches. However, the guns had been miscalibrated, not by much, but enough to leave the front parts of the German defences intact, including all of the foxholes where they'd hunkered down. So of course, in that 15 minutes of calm, ostensibly to give the British troops time to get ready and to go, they'd come back and manned their machine gun posts. So of course, when this line of men started to walk towards them, they just mowed them down. Now Ian's grandfather was very lucky because his part of the line was on a kink and there was a small copse of trees, and he and his men just ran for cover and hunkered down. Wave after wave came forward trying to capture the lines. Wave after wave fell or retreated. And it was only under the cover of darkness towards the end of the day that they too could then retreat back to the safety of their own lines. And of course, hundreds of men dead or dying, the attack a total failure. And Ian couldn't help but stand in his grandfather's shoes for a couple of minutes. This wasn't the same as finding the information in an archive or learning about it from a military historian. He connected with that moment in time by being there. That sense of place and location with story. That's what makes history compelling. That's what makes it powerful. When it's personal, but also it's contextualised in that way. And he reflected, well, what would I have done in that circumstance? And he said, well, if I'd have come back after that, I'd have carried on running to the coast. And we said, yes, you might well have done, but you'd have been rounded up and shot as a deserter. So very sobering. We then looked at his other grandfather, who was a little bit older, and had been in the regular army, and had gone out to South Africa to fight in the Boer War. So once again, this is where interpretation and reality clashed when we took him out to Spion Kop, the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the campaign, where again, his grandfather, his other grandfather, had served. It was nothing like his schoolboy imagination. We showed him the battleground, we showed him the memorials, we showed him the thousands of crosses from both sides. As both sides had tried to gain this strategic high ground at the start of the battle, dug in trenches, and then, with not a yard of ground gained, both sides then left with thousands of dead. So very sobering. 3 stories, but not enough for an episode of Who Do You Think You Are, in the way that we conceived it. We had to find another story to make it a fully fledged episode, and we were struggling. So we went back to Ian's cousin, the one I mentioned was helping us with the First World War story, and said, is there anyone you found in your research that can help us with this military story? And he said, well, not really. You're working from the 1850s. There is someone a bit further back. So we thought, okay, well, let's bend the rules, because we made them, let's break them. And we found someone that he'd discovered called Murdo Matheson, who was also from Scottish descent and had signed up to one of the Highland regiments in the late 18th century. So we had a look, more in hope than expectation, to see whether this character had any discharge to pension / service records, to see whether we could trace his military career. And lo and behold, we struck lucky. In the records at the National Archives, there was a file on Murdo Matheson, from the right place, tiny island Uig, who was born at the right time, filed right next to Murdo Matheson, also from Uig, also born at exactly the right time. And there was nothing to distinguish which was the right one. Now, luckily, they had enlisted in the same regiment at the same time. Clearly some sort of relationship there, but you know, we had a bit of a conflab, and I could hear the crew saying, well, why don't we just, I think the word was fudge it, and follow the regiment around the world, because that will surely tell us the story. And that would have been a brilliant plan if they hadn't been put in separate battalions, and those battalions went in completely opposite ways around the world. So we were no further forward. We knew he was in the military, we knew the regiment, but no further forward. So we went back to the cousin and said, you knew he was in the army, what else have you got? And I could hear one of the crew saying, have you got any photographs? Photographs, 1790s? Possibly not. You know, I can see the logic, you know, military insignia. No photographs, obviously. Nothing that had survived in the family archive in paper form. And then the cousin said, no, I've got nothing, no letters, nothing like that. And he was at a desk, a bit like the one in front of me here, and he just sat down and pulled open a drawer. And he took out an old box, lifted the lid, and said, I'm sure these are no use, but you can have them anyway. And he took out Murdo Matheson's campaign medals, which of course had his regimental number and the clasps of all the places and the battles that he was in. The perfect stuff. But of course, we'd say, but in genealogy, it's a paper research trail. It just comes back to the family archive, doesn't it? These objects, these artefacts, these moments that we put to one side and don't think they hold vital clues. So anyone who has done this sort of research, keep going back. I've got a cache of stuff from my grandmother's estate that we still look at and still find those little clues that suddenly make sense when all the other stuff locks in. So with this information, of course, we found the right Murdo Matheson in the right battalion, who 100 years to the day before Ian's grandfather had gone to South Africa, had also gone out there as well. A lovely end to the story which knitted it together. But even by this point, we decided to change the focus, and that was because of the person that gave the show its name. That person is Bill Oddie. Now, Bill wasn't the most obvious choice for the show. His background suited one of our storylines, which was the Industrial Revolution. His family had started out in the 1780s as yeoman farmers, smallholders, who then had to supplement their income by doing a little bit of weaving, you know, the original cottage industries, to top it up. But by the 1820s, they were based in Yorkshire, they spotted something really quite interesting happening across the border in Lancashire. And probably under the dead of night, the very entrepreneurial folk left their homelands and started out in the emerging factories in places like Blackburn and Darwin, and did really well for themselves. Rose through the ranks, got to middle management, and then 1860s, the whole industry collapsed. You know, let's not talk about our island story as though it's some isolated piece of history. Events in North America, the US Civil War, impacted the southern states because there were blockades stopping cotton coming across the Atlantic into the mills. Now, mill owners who'd kept their eye on the world news at the time decided to stockpile. But unfortunately, Bill's mill, there's a mouthful, Bill's mill didn't. And so the family were left with the real danger of being out of work and starving and losing their lifestyle. So, as their ancestors had done, they left, they went to Rochdale, they signed up on half-time just to get some money in at mills that had actually stockpiled. And that was the Oddie story. Generation after generation involved in industry until we get to Bill, the first to go to university and do something very different. That was our story. Bill wanted to talk about his mum. Bill didn't understand who he was because he didn't understand who his mother was and his rather difficult relationship. Now, Bill's mum had sort of drifted in and out of his childhood. She suffered from mental health problems and had spent a lot of time in hospital and asylums. So he had a very difficult childhood. But he wanted to understand why, what had happened, had something triggered this. And that was his gateway into the rest of his ancestry. He didn't know who he was. Who do I think I am when I can't tell my mum's story? Yeah, we'll use that for the title of the show, because it's really profound. We often skip back 1-2 generations. How far can we go? Where are these? But we don't actually think to start with what shaped us, our immediate environment. And Bill found out something really quite shocking. We thought by investigating this we'd hook his interest, and we found some really quite startling discoveries about his immediate family that answered his question. And we presented it to him in a brown paper envelope. That was the curse of Series 1, presenting stuff in a way that you wouldn't normally do in the real world, but we couldn't wait 3 weeks to get stuff and film him waiting.